Hello, I'm Cindy Haval, and I'm in the studio today instead of on my front porch. And with me I have Scott Davis, Meade High School grad and Gonzaga University history major. I met Scott while doing a story about him in the Spokesman Review, and he has a fascinating website and podcast that we wanted to let viewers know about. Welcome, Scott.
Thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
So your website is Faces of Valor, correct?
Yep, that's it.
And how did that start, and what are the Faces of Valor?
Well, Faces of Valor is a project I started because I was interviewing World War II and Korean War veterans, and I needed a place where I could share these stories and let people know that we have these World War II and Korean War veterans in our community, and these people are still with us, and they need to have their stories shared because they sacrificed for our freedom, and I think that's important to remember.
So tell me where the interest sprang from. Where did that begin, and how did you start your journey into interviewing World War II and Korean War vets?
So I've always been interested in history. Even when I was in first grade, my mom remembers looking for books about World War II that were appropriate for somebody my age. And I guess while other people were watching cartoons, I was watching Mail Call with the Gunny, the guy who recently passed away. So there's always been that interest. And then as I got older, I got into high school and started playing football and kind of lost that. And then my sophomore year in high school, I got a concussion playing football, and that was kind of the end of football for me.
Oh, my goodness.
And so I kind of floated for a little bit, and then I was in a world history class, and the topic happened to be World War II. And I rediscovered this passion I had, and I found that it was something I still enjoyed learning about. And I think it was that year in 2015 that I was watching a video of Soaring Valor, this Gary Sinise program where he flies World War II veterans back to the National World War II Museum and shows them the museum and honors them. And I was seeing these guys, and most of them were in wheelchairs, and they were in their 80s and 90s at that point. And I think the youngest one could have been was about 89 in 2015. And I thought, well, if I don't meet one of these guys, I'm never going to have the opportunity to do that. So I called the local VFW, and like I said, I think I'd watched Band of Brothers a few too many times because I said, I want to meet a World War II paratrooper, not any World War II veteran. And the guy said, well, we'll look. We don't know if we can find a World War II paratrooper in the area, but we'll give you a call back. We can.
Why a paratrooper?
I watched Band of Brothers, and that's about E Company, 2nd Battalion, 506 Parachute Infantry Regiment, and they were played up as a special unit, and they were elite and all this in the miniseries. So that kind of sparked that, I guess, and made me want to meet one of these unique guys.
Do you have any veterans in your family?
Yeah, my dad was in the Navy. He was on nuclear submarine. Then my grandpa served in Korea, and my great-grandfather was wounded in France. He passed before I was born, though. So. My
goodness, did you hear stories about your great-grandfather then from your family about his time of service, or no?
A little bit, not much. There's still pieces that we're not quite sure about. He had some trouble with his memories, I think, and so you got pieces of stories, and then you got stuff what we don't know if it was true or not. And it was only, I don't remember my grandpa talking about Korea until this recent years. So for whatever reason, it's become something that's really important and something that he started sharing. And
so back to the calling the VFW. That's kind of a random call. How old were you at the time?
17.
17-year-old kid wants to meet a World War paratrooper.
Yeah, paratrooper.
Were you able to connect?
Yeah, they got back to me about 2 weeks later with a guy named Alan Wood who served with the 82nd Airborne. He jumped into Holland, and they said he'd be happy to talk to you. And I can't remember how we got set up at a time, and I went down there and did the interview. And at 17, I didn't know how to do an interview, and I did it, and it wasn't my best work by any means, but I did the interview, and I left, and I kind of said, okay, I've interviewed a World War II veteran. I can say I've done that. And then it started playing, well, maybe I should do another. And that's kind of how this started and how I started interviewing these veterans.
So that was just one interview, but it got you hooked enough to want to talk to more?
Yep, yeah.
And hear more stories.
Yeah.
So what did you do with that first interview? Did you write a paper? Did you put up a blog?
I just kept it. I just had it. And
you wanted to do more?
Yeah, that's just how it started. I didn't have a purpose really. It kind of developed into, I knew I wanted to teach history, so it kind of developed into, I tell people, well, I want to teach, and when I'm teaching, I want to be able to talk about real guys, and it's kind of blossomed from that, I suppose.
Blossom is right, because that was 4 years ago,
Yeah.
right? So how many World War II and Korean War vets have you interviewed to date?
Just under 120 now. I think I'm right about there.
That's a lot. All from the Pacific Northwest?
Yeah. I've interviewed guys Seattle, Portland. I went down to Boise, mostly in this area, just for reasons of mobility and time, money. Things
And
like
how
that.
are you finding these?
I look through old newspapers. I look on Facebook. If somebody says my dad, World War II veteran, celebrating his 92nd birthday, I'll send him a message and say, "Hey, is your dad interested in doing an interview?" I'll call people. And recently, with some of the media attention I've had people come to me, which is a change up, and it's a lot easier because I just say name a time and place, and we'll do it. So I've been very fortunate in that.
Well, I think you mentioned when we talked earlier, sometimes you've actually had to just write letters because there's no other way you can find to get a hold of family members or something. And you've had response to letters as well?
Yeah, I've had a very good response to letters. I actually just sent some this week. If
The old-fashioned way.
Yeah, exactly. If there's somebody, because when you call somebody and you cold call, you're kind of taking a chance that you're not going to sound like somebody that's trying to scam them or.
I do that for a living, so yeah. When they hear someone from the newspapers calling, you get interesting.
Yeah,
responses.
exactly. Yeah, I'm
I
sure.
can imagine when you don't have that behind you, that you might get people who think are you going to take advantage of my loved one
exactly.
or something.
Exactly.
But now you've got this website and you're compiling all the stories. When did you start that?
I think I've had a website for. It's been over a year now, but over the summer I updated it, and I put up all these pictures of these guys, so then you can actually click on individual people and look at the stories. So that's pretty new, that you can actually read some of their stories now and see their faces.
And are you adding to the stories once you get them up there? Are you fleshing them out a little bit more? Or are you just putting one or two sentences per picture?
It kind of depends. There's some people I've written articles about, and I'll put the article up there. There's some people where it's pretty brief, one sentence, two sentences. And that's something I've been kind of developing because it obviously takes time to put up new people.
And you're a full-time college student at Gonzaga University, right?
Yeah, so there's my time is really split, and I'm trying to figure out what's important and what can wait, and sometimes that can wait.
So from facesofvalor.org, the website, then you recently also launched a podcast, correct? What's the name of that?
That's the Voices of Valor podcast. World War II Chronicles, decided to split it up, World War II to Korean War veterans.
And what prompted a podcast?
Well, I looked around, and there are other people that do interviews with World War II veterans, and the medium that wasn't being capitalized on was the podcast. I looked around and kind of shopped around a little bit to see, is there anybody else that is interviewing veterans that is putting out a podcast and sharing these stories? And I didn't think anybody was doing that. There were videos, and there were different kind of YouTube channels and things like that, but the podcast wasn't being utilized, and I thought, okay, that's something that's unique that maybe I can find a niche in.
And how has that been going for you? Have you gotten a good response to the podcast? It's fairly new.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I've gotten a pretty good response. I'm still developing what I want it to look like and what I want the episodes to sound like. And again, with school starting, I haven't had much time to look at it recently, but people have said they've liked the concept, so I'm hoping to, once I get some more time, to build on that a little bit more. So.
Well, for me, what was most fascinating is hearing the veteran stories in their own words and getting to listen to these voices that we probably aren't going to have with us much longer. So I would think that would be a huge draw for people who want to hear their stories in their own words. Are there any one or two certain stories that you found especially compelling that you wanted to be sure you put on the podcast, and a story that you like to tell, a person that you met?
Well, yeah, I started off with the first podcast is about Joe DeLay, who served with the 101st Airborne during World War II, and I chose that because that link to Band of Brothers. A lot of people have seen Band of Brothers, and I thought a paratrooper is going to be captivating. That'll catch somebody's attention. They might want to hear the story. Not to mention Joe had a pretty good story, and he was really a nice guy. So I chose that one and put that together. And for the other podcasts, I'm just kind of picking and choosing.
What made Joe's story special aside from the Band of Brothers connection?
He didn't talk about the war for a long time, and I actually just got a message from his granddaughter, and she was telling me that it was only in the last couple of years that he'd ever mentioned that he'd fought in World War II. So it was how raw, I guess, some of them were, and there were a couple of times where his eyes got glossy, and he just stared for a second, and you could tell from speaking with him that he was back there, that he was in the Ardennes forest, and he was being shelled or he was being shot at. So it was a fascinating story just because how close it was still to him.
And is there a certain question that you always ask these veterans when you interview them? Is there one question you come back to, and what is that question?
I usually ask two questions at the end, first being, what advice do you have for young people today? And that always gets big response, and people say, "Oh, well, I could talk for an hour about that." But and then
any certain response that you hear repeatedly?
I've gotten a lot. Join the military. That was
really,
yeah. I get that a lot, probably over half the time. I mean,
interesting.
Somebody will say that. Yeah, I think because for a lot of these guys, that was the biggest event of their life. That was where they grew up. That was where they made decisions that mattered, and they set themselves up for the rest of their lives from their military career. So it is.
And the second question you always ask?
What does America mean to you? Yeah, that also elicits some pretty powerful responses.
Is there a common thread in the responses of what America means to our remaining World War II veterans?
Mm-hmm. Usually it's without even thinking about freedom. And a lot of them will expand and say I've had such wonderful opportunities here, and they think this is just the greatest country in the world, and sometimes they're a little afraid that we might be losing that sentiment, but that's how they feel, and they earned it.
After 120 interviews, what do these stories mean to you? How have they changed your life, if they have?
I've learned a lot about what it means to live a good life, what it means to be a man. There's just these life lessons that these people have, and they want to share it, because you think, well, what's a person in their 80s or 90s want? Do they want material things? I mean, I'm sure if you offered them a car, maybe some of them would take it, but they really want three things. They want to know that, one, that people are going to remember them, two, what they did in this world mattered, and three, that I lost the third one, that what people want mattered. I lost the last one, but that's basically what they want. They just want to know what they mattered, what they did in this world mattered, and that they're going to be remembered. So it's.
Any plans to write a book, or what are you going to do with all of these interviews? And now that you've branched into the Korean War, a lot of those stories are being lost too if we don't listen to them. So, any plans to do anything with all of these stories?
Yeah, eventually I'd like to write a book. There's certain aspects of these wars that I think that need to be covered more. I think the war in the Pacific is something that's really misunderstood, because a lot of people say it was some sort of racial war that we fought, and it was a collision of cultures that were antithetical to one another, and so you get these weird ideas about these portions of these wars, and I think that needs to be set straight, and especially with the Korean War, which is known as the Forgotten War, that needs to be remembered as well. So
absolutely. Well, thank you for what you're doing to preserve these stories in our community. And again, would you like to tell our viewers the name of the website and also the podcast?
Yeah, so the website is facesofvalor.org, and then the podcast is the Voice of Valor podcast, World War II Chronicles.
And you're also on Instagram, I know, and Facebook as well?
Yeah, yep.
Any
Facebook,
other social media?
Nope, just Facebook, Instagram, and it's Faces of Valor again. And that's Instagram's where I put most of my energy, where I'm posting almost every day. So.
Well, thank you so much. This is Cindy Aval with Scott Davis, Faces of Valor.